So today is the last speaker for API Heritage Month, and we're so proud to host Helen Zia. Helen is a writer, an activist, and a Fulbright scholar. She's the author of Asian American Dreams, The Emergence of an American People, about the contemporary civil rights struggles of Asian Americans. Her latest book, Last Boat Out of Shanghai, The Epic Story of the Chinese Who Fled Mao's Revolution, was an NPR Best Book of 2019 and shortlisted for the 2020 National PEN America Award. An award-winning magazine journalist, she was the executive director of MS Magazine, where she reported on the neo-Nazi and the white supremacist organizations, sparked new thinking on the relationship between race and gender and hate violence. The daughter of Chinese immigrants, Helen has been outspoken on issues ranging from human rights to countering hate, violence, and homophobia. Her leadership in the landmark civil rights case of anti-Asian violence in the 1982 hate killing of Vincent Chin in Detroit has been documented within the Oscar-nominated film Who Killed Vincent Chin. Helen has an honorary doctorate from the University of San Francisco and the University of New York Law School. She attended Princeton on a full scholarship and was a member of its first graduating class of women. Helen quit medical school to work as a construction laborer and an auto worker and a community organizer until she discovered her life's work as a journalist and a writer. So thank you, Helen, for being here today.
Thank you, Jordana. Thank you for that very generous introduction. Thank you and the Student Affairs Office and the whole Bellevue College community for inviting me to be part of your Asian Pacific Heritage Month activities. It's just an important time, and certainly this month there have been so many things that have been happening. Yesterday, we faced the 1 year since George Floyd was murdered. And so in that journey, all of us have been part of. It's more important than ever that we raise our voices and we try to really create a world where all human beings are respected for their full human dignity. And so as part of Asian Pacific American Heritage Month, I'm going to talk a little bit about the background of what brought us to this day and what we can do about it, and the things that I call MIH, missing in history. So I also want to do a shout out to Ka for that amazing music video that just played. It was so moving. I mean, it brought me to tears to see it. And I would love to lift up her video. So Jordana, maybe you can tell me how to do that afterward, but thank you for sharing that. So what I'd like to do is to share my screen and start my slideshow. And so let's get that going. Okay, it worked. And here it's, some of my books, but mainly this is my social media handle. I do have a website. And so if you have questions or just want to keep up, that's one way to do it. I do want to start, yes, this is a text heavy slide, but to say where we are, as Asian Americans, we've been fighting, we've all been fighting multiple pandemics here, but COVID and racism have hit the AAPI community incredibly like a tsunami, and not just in recent months, but really for the last year and a half before even any, of the virus was identified in America. As soon as COVID was named in China, December 2019, Asian Americans, Asian American communities began feeling the hate, the harassment, the violence. And so there's even a question about whether communities like Chinatowns, Asian ghettos, Chinatowns, little Tokyos, Manila towns, little Saigons and little Indias, whether they'll continue because they have been so devastated. And some of you may have seen that, the tracking of the anti-Asian hate. There is one website in the entire country that was created by a community organization that at this point, it was created in March 2020. And at this point, they've recorded more than 7,000 incidents of anti-Asian hate. That's one website. So we know that there's an incredible undercount there. And from their data, of the reports that they've been receiving, the people that have been most targeted are the vulnerable people in the Asian American community, elderly people. We've seen the viral videos of 80 and 90-year-old people who can barely walk, who are going out for their walk, who have been knocked down and beaten to death, sadly. We know that children have been harassed, in a playground. Children who are being harassed mainly by adults, more than one adult at a time. And the reports show that often there are other adults standing around who do nothing. We also know that 2 out of every 3 of these attacks have been against an Asian American woman or girl. And so the other piece is that even though this began as a call out to say everything wrong that's going wrong in America today is because of China, the vast majority of people who have been attacked are not actually Chinese. So we know that this has a basis in racism, of targeting anybody who looks Chinese, but not only East Asians. Brown Asian Americans have also been subjected to these harassments and attacks. And we see that this is part of really a global pandemic of violence, that there's been homophobic and transphobic attacks have skyrocketed as well. We've just seen reports of the anti-Semitic attacks that have been going on. And the Islamophobia, post 9/11 has never gone away. And in addition to the mass killing that took place in Atlanta of targeting Asian women, a couple weeks after that, there was the mass killing in Indianapolis that was targeting South Asian Sikh Americans. And globally, gender violence has been off the roof, off the charts. So there is violence, harassment that's been going on, and for Asian Americans, it literally has been a nightmare of a tsunami. So I want to talk about, where does this come from? And so I'm going to step back a little bit. Some of you may already be familiar with just the notion that, there's a huge diversity of Asian Americans. After all, Asia is the largest continent in the world. And within that, there are the majority of human beings in the world. So, well over 3 to 4 billion people. And clearly there's going to be a huge range of diversity of cultures, languages, colors, ethnicities, religions, and all of those things. But in America, we come together, and I just have here a little slide to show just a little bit of the diversity that may be somewhat different from what comes to mind when we think of what does an Asian American Pacific Islander look like. And so we get questions like, what are you? Or where are you really from? And for me, I've always had to answer that, New Jersey. That's where I'm really from. And of course, as an AAPI people, we know that that's never the answer that they really want, no matter how many generations of being an American somebody of Asian American or Pacific Islander descent might be. And the real question is, you're not from here. You don't belong here. So what are you? Where are you really from? And, I want to give another visual here to the what are you? It is that we are human beings. We are fully human. And because we are human, we are all complex beings. And that means we are multidimensional. We have many different identities. Everybody on this particular slide is an Asian American or Pacific Islander. We are multiracial people. We have gender nonconforming human beings. We have members of our communities who are transnational adoptees. And so we have many different ways that we appear and that we are in the world. And, to these questions, I do want to say, this is part of the racism and the systemic racism that Asian Americans experience every day. And to some people, they think that these are insignificant. They are microaggressions. Well, to me, microaggressions is actually a misnomer. It really should be called micro-racism, because the term micro doesn't mean small. It comes from the paradigm created when we study economics. There's microeconomics and there's macroeconomics. Microeconomics is the kind of exchange that happens one-on-one between individuals or one-on-one with a store or a shop, or that's what makes up microeconomics. Macroeconomics is the governmental policies, what we think of as systemic economics. And so in the realm of racism, there is micro-racism, which is the individual interactions or the, street level interactions. And macro racism is what we're talking about when we say we really have to make institutional change the policies that will end white supremacy, for example. That is a macro racism. And nobody says that micro or macroeconomics, one is more important than the other, because they really go together. And the micro racism that people experience on a day-to-day level is part and parcel that engenders the macro racism. It makes macro racism possible. And so I want to point that out, that the what are you and that where are you really from, that is all part of a daily racial construct that Asian Americans in particular face. And so if we don't have real information about who are Asian Americans, where we are really from, and all of that stuff. This slide, I'm not going to walk through. This is the numbers, please ignore, they're actually out of date. But to actually see a list, that this is an incomplete list, this is a short list of some of the Asian ethnicities and some of the Pacific Islander ethnicities. There really are a lot more. But so when we think about Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, it really encompasses a very diverse range of people. And instead, what happens is when we're all lumped together and people don't see that they're within the umbrella of AAPI, there's actually large disparity. And so one of the ways that we are all lumped together is to be viewed as the, quote, model minority. The model minority racist myth that says that all Asians, they do better than white people. They're white adjacent, they're honorary white people, and they're all rich. And so if we just break down some of these ethnicities, we can see within our communities, there is a variation in terms of how much poverty there is within our API communities. And this is just doesn't encompass everything, but you can see that within the, especially groups that arrived as refugees from war, that they have now actually multi-generational poverty rates that exceed, those of most other American groups. And even groups like the Chinese, who generationally as Americans have been in the USA a lot longer, the rate of poverty is also quite high. There's a recent statistic I heard that in New York City, the racial group with the highest rate of poverty are Asian Americans. And this goes completely counter to the idea that we are all the rich model minority. And along with that, there's the view that all Asian Americans end up in like the most elite schools. Well, actually, most Asian Americans go to community colleges and state colleges and universities. And we can see here that, again, broken down by ethnicity, there is a very high rate of Asian Americans, Pacific Islanders who do not complete high school. My own mother, for example, didn't go beyond the 3rd grade. And I think if you talk to most any Asian American family, you will actually find that the notion that everybody has gone to an elite school and gotten multiple postgraduate degrees is simply not true. So I want to just say a couple words here about where this, and I'll say more about it, but where did this divisive myth of the model minority come from? Well, so much about Asian Americans is what I call MIH, missing in history. And almost entirely our history up until about 60 years ago was about being the enemy, always being the foreign invader, always being the, where did you really come from? Because you're not from here, and you're not really an American. But something happened in 1966. It has a time and a place. The racist model minority myth was created then. We can pinpoint it to two articles that appeared in the Sunday New York Times and another in the US News and World Report magazine, where a white sociologist wrote two different stories about how Asian people are at a time when the whole country is worrying about race and the plight of racial minorities. Asian Americans are winning wealth and respect by their hard work and not a welfare check. Well, right there, you can see there's a whole lot of loaded language and what was going on in 1966. The civil rights movement was going on. And suddenly this group, this whole, panoply of AAPI people who had and still are seen as the enemy of America, suddenly became a model minority in order to be pitted against Black people in particular, who were leading the civil rights movement, but have now become so absorbed into the public consciousness that it's like, well, you Asian Americans, you're honorary white people, you're white complacent, you're white adjacent, you're complicit. And the thing about it is, if we believe that, if we're Asian American and we've internalized it, or if we're not Asian and you believe that, you're being manipulated. And that was the whole point of this, to manipulate our communities in a way that we will be divided against each other so that we can't come together. So I want to say, and the rest of my slides are mostly pictures, but this one I wanted to give just a list that I'm, about what's missing in history. Let me just give you a thumbnail of things that, I'm sure you'll find things in here that you had no idea. So Asian Americans, Pacific Islanders on the North American continent, when would you think that began? Well, actually in the 1500s. 1500s. Why? Because what was Columbus looking for, right? He was finding a route to Asia. And so once Spain, who had sponsored Columbus, right? They started the Spanish galleon trade, which triangulated between Spain, the Americas, and the Philippines. And so who came along in those voyages to pick up goods for trade? People came, and Polynesians and Filipinos were well known to be the navigators of the Pacific. And so human beings came along too. And we see that even in 1635, there are records in Spain about Chinese who were in now what is we know of as Mexico, that Filipino communities were thriving in what is now Louisiana. The Continental Congress in the 1700s and newspapers of that time reported on Chinese and Indian people from Asia who were, out and about too. And who would think that during the Civil War of America, the war between the North and South, there were actually hundreds of Asian and Pacific Islander men fighting in that war. It's in the muster rolls, it's recorded. And, so I just want to bring your attention to the few things that you might have heard about if you ever had any knowledge at all about Asian American history, and that's the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. But before the Chinese Exclusion Act, there was in 1875, the Page Act. What was the Page Act? The Page Act excluded Chinese women from America. Why? Because they were seen as filthy, immoral, disgusting, disease-bearing creatures, and they were considered all to be prostitutes. So when we think back to that mass killing in Atlanta that sought out Asian businesses, Asian spas, and killed 6 Asian American women and 2 others, and the police immediately came out and said, "Oh, this has nothing to do with race. The guy was having a bad day." Well, I think the 8 people who were killed and their families had a really bad day. But to discount it and show no inkling that there was a connection to race. Actually, American law is embedded with the idea that Asian American women are filthy and immoral. And then that was followed by the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. And the land that Bellevue College is situated on, and the entire Western United States, there was an ethnic cleansing to get rid of all people of first Chinese background and later extended to every other Asian ethnicity that was in the Western United States and elsewhere too, because it got embedded in federal law. But in the Western United States, there was massacres, lynchings, burning out of communities. And that took place on a number of years and kind of culminated in the Chinese Exclusion Act that later was extended to all people from Asia. And of course, I understand that visits have been done by Bellevue students to Minidoka, one of the concentration camps, the internment camps of Japanese Americans during World War II. But for the most part, these things are MIH, missing in history. And when people don't have real information in their heads about Asian Americans, and we know they don't. We know that K through 12 and preschool, nobody gets any information at all about Asian Americans, except maybe an inkling about the railroads or maybe about the incarceration of Japanese Americans. But except for that, what is there? Well, it's not a void. What there is instead are racist stereotypes. And yes, gook is a racial slur, but it is the predominant way that Asian Americans have been viewed through American history, and gooks, geishas, and geeks. And that is the information that most Americans have about who Asian Americans are. So let me talk a little bit about the gook, the enemy, the one who needs to be killed and eliminated or ethnically cleansed from America. Well, there's a master narrative about, that there is a yellow peril. Today, if you were to, surveys show over and over again that when people are asked, what is the existential threat to America? For the last 20 years, it's been China, actually longer than the last 20 years. But we can trace this much further back to movies. This is just one. This guy in the middle, he's an alien. He's not an alien from overseas. He is an alien creature from outer space. And his intent is to destroy the globe, the Earth. And of course, what does he look like? Well, first of all, he's a white man in yellow face, but with the caricatures that are sort of to make him seem demonic, diabolical, unscrupulous, sinister. And we can then go to, video games. Popular video games, shoot them up. You kill the enemy before they kill you, and you get points for killing them. Well, so many of them have the same caricatures, same diabolical features, inhuman features that are ascribed to people who are supposed to be Asian. And we can go to the news media and look at magazines, magazine cover after magazine cover, and in the streaming world, same thing, images of the next Cold War. Well, clearly this is a yellow face and a yellow eye peeking out, and it's clearly about China. This actual cover comes from the 1990s, but it could be today, because that is the constant drumbeat. Once a gook, always a gook, never an American. And then I told you a little bit about the model minority. Well, then there's this view, the flip side of the gook is the geek. Who is the geek? Who is the worker bee model minority racist stereotype that nobody ever wants to be friends with? They are just, just ridiculous people that you make fun of, in the workplace, however, or maybe on campus. They're the ones who get called in the middle of the night to say, hey, can you solve this for me? But, because they're not really human, they're just like ants or worker bees. They're considered to have no emotion, no emotional content. you know, they don't feel good or bad, you know, they just never complain, and therefore they can never be seen as leaders. And these are from two very famous films. This is, of course, you know, a white man made up to be a ridiculous looking creature of what he or the directors imagined that an Asian person looked like. This is from Breakfast at Tiffany's, the iconic film. However, that was ruined by having this, you know, target of ridicule run through the whole film. You know, this racist creature. And here is a, you know, fast forwarding to a film for high schools, you know, for high schoolers, 16 Candles. And one of its most horrible characters in there was the Asian guy, the geeky guy who everybody just made fun of. And they gave him the name of Long Duck Dong, which then became, you know, ammunition to bully an entire generation of Asian American kids. And then it gets genderized. Oh, well, here, before that, you know, you can take the gooks and the geeks, and in today's world, it means, you know, just as the coolies built the railroads, you know, those worker bee hordes of Asians who came and built the railroads, and when they were finished, they were, you know, disposable. Well, today we have high-tech coolies. And these are real people. These are real Asian American scientists who have been falsely accused of being spies for the People's Republic of China. Both of them were arrested and charged, had their reputations ruined. Sherry Chen lost her job and is still fighting for it. And then the FBI dropped their cases because they realized that, oh, actually they had made a mistake, you know. And however, you can't restore somebody's reputation. And they are just two of hundreds of other Asian Americans, Chinese Americans who have been targeted today as the geeks who are also gooks. And there is also gender, the geishas. And when you genderize race for Asian American women, there's the two aspects, the diabolical, sinister, but exotic Asian woman. This is a real, you know, one of the only real actors in Hollywood who is really Asian for decades. This particular picture is more than 100 years old. It's Anna May Wong. She was an incredibly talented actress, but she was reduced to having to play roles like this, where she ran around half naked as the exotic temptress, but she was evil. She could kill you. And then the flip side of that, as the model minority racist myth evolved. And so you have the Asian woman who is still exotic and attractive, but her only role is to be submissive and to cater to every whim of a man. And in Hollywood, it was always a white man, and she would never complain, you know. But okay, those are older movies. What about today? Well, here, let's look at Lucy Liu. She is actually in the exact same sort of portrayal that was done 100 years ago. The exotic, but deadly and diabolical Asian female. And then look, she can flip to becoming the passive, exotic Asian woman whose only role is to please a man, a white man. And so this is how Asian women have been depicted for so long. And so when the police in Atlanta said race has nothing to do with seeking out and killing Asian women, that was completely wrong. And why are Asian American? How does this continue to be perpetuated? Well, you know, this is just a map of some of the U.S. forces overseas, and so Asian, you know, all of these different locations and more of where our U.S. military is stationed, and along with the bases come places for the GIs to go for R&R. And there are so many countries and communities in Asia that just want to get rid of the bases because the treatment of Asian women around those bases has led to, you know, violence and death for Asian women. And in GI slang, R&R stands for rape and run. So these are some of the things that we know are in the public consciousness about Asian American women. And so geishas, you know, short of violence in the workplace, let me just say that if a stereotype, an image of a woman is that she is going to be exotic, desirable, and also passive and won't fight back to a predator, that makes for a perfect idealized victim. And so what we see even in the workplace are cases that make it into the public record because lawsuits, you know, and it takes a lot to file a lawsuit in a workplace, right? Against your, you know, your bread and butter. But when they actually rise to the level of a public record in a lawsuit that then the public can know about, if you look at these lawsuits for sexual harassment, a very large number of them have been filed by Asian American women because of this very false stereotype, this false image of being a geisha, you know, the geek and the gook combined in a genderized racist view. So I want to kind of make a transition here to say, yes, America has a very long history of racism in many forms, right? We know from the 1619 Project that how we can trace the treatment of Black people in America and what that has meant in terms of institutionalized racism and what the country has been built on, or the genocide of indigenous Native American people that's gone on. But, you know, Asian Americans have a place in American history too, that is deeply rooted in the white supremacy and the racism. And so this particular sign, for example, comes from the 1800s. Chinese, no, 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 we are gathering together to get rid of them. Here's a woman who, and I'm not sure exactly where this house is. It could have been in Washington. It could have been, you know, somewhere in the Northwest, but she was so proud of being her white supremacist viewpoint that she put a huge sign on her house. And this was part of the rounding up and incarceration of every person of Japanese descent from the West Coast. We know that our brown Asian brothers and sisters have not been spared. Islamophobia ever since, you know, 9/11 and before has led to the attacks and targeting of people who, quote, look Muslim, which anybody can be Muslim. But so these are Sikh Americans. They're, and we know that the mass killing in Indianapolis that came only a couple of weeks after the mass shooting in Atlanta was targeting Sikh Americans. And up here I have a picture of something that I was part of. This is Vincent Chin, a Chinese American who was killed in 1982 because he looked Japanese. And this was just an image I have from that time. You know, the 1980s were a time of a great recession, a economic crisis that began at the end of the 1970s. It was an oil crisis in the Middle East, but that led to the collapse of the auto industry. And how did Japan get involved in that? Well, Japan was blamed because it was, they made fuel efficient cars. How terrible is that? And people were buying fuel efficient cars as opposed to the Detroit dinosaurs that could only get 7 or 8 or 9 miles a gallon. And so Japan was suddenly the enemy. Here is, again, using that very racist caricature applied to a car, dropping a bomb on the city of Detroit. Now, I just want to point out, though, that Germany also then and now makes very fuel efficient cars, and people were buying them as well as Japanese cars. But racism only works, and you can only target people when they look different. And so that's how in the middle of intense anti-Japanese innuendo, hatred throughout the Midwest and really across America, very similar to the anti Chinese rhetoric that has gone on and the anti-Asian hate that's gone on today, in the middle of that, a young man named Vincent Chin was about to get married. He was at his bachelor party, and two white auto workers sat across from him, looked at him, saw he was having a good time at his bachelor party, and said, "It's because of you mother Fs that we're out of work." And then they were all ejected from the bar, and the two white auto workers chased Vincent Chin, stalked him through the streets of Detroit. And when they found him, they one held him in a bear hug, and the other took a baseball bat as though he was going for home runs to Vincent Chin's head, and he was killed. And so his 400 wedding guests went to his funeral instead. And out of this terrible hate crime came a movement of Asian Americans coming together really for the first time in American history to stand up against racism and to come together as a Pan-Asian movement, in that umbrella of Asian American Pacific Islander people, and also joining together with other communities. It was in Detroit. We joined together with Black, brown, red, people of all religions, all really people of conscience, standing together to say that, say no to racist hate. And so I want to say that there really is a long history of Asian Americans and other people coming together to fight the kind of things that I was talking about, the systemic racism. And so I want to show you just a handful of those stories. And so I wonder how many of you actually recognize either of these two people. Well, everybody actually needs to know this man. If your grandparents, your ancestors, you yourself might have arrived in the United States as an immigrant or a refugee, it's because of Wong Kim Ark, a Chinese American, that children born in America are American citizens. How did that happen? Wong Kim Ark was born in America in the 1800s. He left the US for a brief time, and when he came back, the Chinese Exclusion Act was in place. And he was told, you can't come back. You're barred from America. And he fought that with the Chinese community all the way to the Supreme Court of America, and they won. And so the Supreme Court in 1898 ruled that Wong Kim Ark, because he was born in America, had the birthright American citizenship. And that's where every immigrant who has ever come through Ellis Island from anywhere in Europe can thank Wong Kim Ark, and from really anywhere in the globe can thank Wong Kim Ark for the fact that their descendants are American citizens. And when I learned this, I have to tell you, I was already an adult, and I felt, just amazed to learn this, but also angry that I didn't know this when I was a kid. And for every time I was told, go back where you came from, or where are you really from? I could say, well, you go back where you came from, and where are you really from? Because you can thank a Chinese American for the fact that you and your family are Americans. And who is this right next to Wong Kim Ark? This is Frederick Douglass, one of the great leaders of the 1800s. He was born in slavery and then rose to become one of the leading intellectuals and orators and thinkers of that time. They were contemporaries, and Frederick Douglass said in his leadership voice, when the Chinese Exclusion Act was under consideration, he said, the Chinese Exclusion Act and all of these exclusionary laws are bad for America. We must oppose them. The Black community must oppose the Chinese Exclusion Act and more. And so, here way back into the 1800s, we, at a time today where we're so sort of bombarded with messages to say, well, I don't know if we could ever be allies, that is solidarity even attainable? Actually, we can go back into our history and see there have been many, many, many times when people of communities today that are questioning, could we come together, have been together. And so we don't have to go back to the 1800s. Let's look at the civil rights movement. This is the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King in Selma, Alabama, one of the marches across the Pettus Bridge. There's a movie called Selma now. You can learn about why they were marching, but what is this they have around their necks? These are flower leis. Where did these flower leis come from? They came from Hawaii, from people who came to march in the freedom marches and brought flower leis along to give to the first, leadership line in this march across the Pettus Bridge. They brought a banner with them too. They say, Hawaii knows that integration works. They came as to show their multiracial support for the freedom marches. And it's not just Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders from Hawaii who supported the civil rights movement. There are many people alive today who are part from the Asian American Pacific Islander communities who were part of the civil rights movement. But as I said, these things are MIH. They're missing in history. And so instead we are told and bombarded with these messages that we can never join together. We've never been together. But you know what? There are other examples too. What about the labor movement? What about the Chicano Latinx movement for labor rights in the farm fields of California? This is Cesar Chavez, the leader of the United Farm Workers Union. And before it was a United Farm Workers Union, it was the National Farm Workers. That was the Chicano Farm Workers Union. And who is this next to him? This is Larry Itliong, a Filipino-American labor leader who was leading the Filipino Farm Workers Union. And why were there two different, ethnicities? Well, divide and conquer is one strategy that many employers, whether it's on plantations or farms or factories, have used over time. I saw it when I was a factory worker in Detroit. The plantations of Hawaii have a lot of history about how different ethnicities were thrown together so that they would never unite. But Larry Itliong and the Filipino farm workers approached the Chicano farm workers and said, you know what, we can improve the lives of the human beings who toil, doing this stoop labor in the fields. We can have a fight for livable wages and better working conditions if we join together. And so this is a scene of the great boycott that the United Farm Workers led and won together. But this kind of racial unity, missing in history. Who knows about these things? And what about gender? Well, this is Patsy Mink, the very first woman of color to be elected to the US Congress. She fought barriers of sexism just for the right to run for office. And she overcame them and won and got elected. And what did she do when she was in Congress? Among the many things, she fought for the rights of women. She fought for the Equal Rights Amendment, Title VII, which is about equality, gender equality in the workplace. And Title IX was her signature legislation. Title IX is about the right of girls to play sports in school. So any girl at K through 12 who's ever played soccer or any other sport can thank Patsy Mink for her efforts on that. And, missing in history, MIH. I'd like to just draw attention to, as we approach Pride Month, to the marriage equality movement. Well, one of the very first lawsuits on behalf of same-sex couples who are fighting for the right to be able to be married actually came from Hawaii, a place of where Pacific Islander and Asian Americans were part of the named plaintiffs who brought the first lawsuit that then kicked off the national civil rights movement for the right to marry. And that allowed me to marry my wife, who I've been with for 30 years and had never, ever in my life imagined that we might be able to be married. And I can thank these couples in Hawaii, Asian American Pacific Islander couples who first initiated, the efforts to win that right that have become a worldwide movement and, across Asia as well, to support marriage equality. But again, MIH, missing in history. the intersectionality of people coming together to fight for our common humanity. So I want to kind of bring it to today to say that, you know what, we cannot allow the stories of solidarity that are happening today to go MIH for the future. There are so many divisive videos that have gone viral that we see over and over again. For example, images of Black people attacking Asian people. Now, what we don't see are the voices of you know, Black Americans, Black leaders who have stood up and said, anti-Asian hate is wrong. We must stop it. So for example, here is the Reverend Jesse Jackson. This is an old photo. He is with the mother of Vincent Chin here. Jesse Jackson was one of the first leaders, not one of, he was the first, you know, non-Asian American leader to stand up and say that the hate that killed Vincent Chin was wrong. And he came to the Asian American community to show his support. Well, when this current tsunami of anti-Asian hate arose, he came out with a very strong statement condemning anti-Asian hate. And so did Stacey Abrams. So did Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. So did Mayor Lance Bottoms in Atlanta. So did, if you look at the chat rooms about, you know, on social media, so do many, many other non-Asians come out saying that anti-Asian hate must be stopped. And yet those are not the things that go viral. And so I think it, you know, every one of us has to ask and put it on your own social media, contact the, you know, the news media and say, well, wait a minute, you're showing this scene over and over again. What about the statements of solidarity? Because we actually have to move to a time in America, long past the time, showing scenes of people coming together and, you know, really trying to remember history and reclaim what is missing in history, because we are, you know, actually there are already 10 states, 12 states in the country that have passed the point of where there is no majority race. The entire country that is a trend that's been going on for decades. That genie, no matter how many people want to make America white again, that genie is not going back into the bottle. This is America today. And unless we can begin to envision, to really envision what the lived unity of all of us in a community together, and in the word community is the word unity, and to go beyond allyship to say, you know what, we really are all part of one country, one community, you know, however we look at those communities. And, you know, we have to come together. We've done it before, and this is the vision we have to see again for the future. And as the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King has said, the arc of history is long, but it bends toward justice. And I will just add that we have to help it bend. So with that, I think I want to just end with a few other scenes of multiracial, multicultural unity. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that we can turn to your questions here. So thank you for letting me present this information to you.
Thank you so much, Helen. Before we go to any questions, I would just like to state that if I can speak English today, it was because of Asian American, more specifically Chinese American activism on Lau versus Nichols from 1973. And if I have that information today is because Professor Nan Ma, who taught Asian American Studies here in Bellevue College, taught me that last fall quarter when I took Asian American Studies. And so I'm forever grateful, not just because of Asian American activism, but because also I had the opportunity, and from what today seems a privilege, to study Asian American, to take Asian American Studies with Professor Nan Ma. And this quarter, Professor Tony Vo is teaching it. So I would like to thank you so much for bringing up this issue about missing history. And I would like to thank them for supplementing that education that I did not have and for teaching me all those things. So I'm gonna open to questions, and feel free to raise your hand or to unmute yourself. We'll just go and see like if it's more organized. But thank you so much. This was amazing. This was an amazing presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Jordana.
Hello. You brought up show references. What do you think about the girl from Karate Kid that in one of the movies where she's sort of like a dancer?
Oh,
Do you
yeah,
remember her?
I'm afraid that I am not familiar. I'm not remembering the girl that you're talking about in Karate Kid.
That's okay.
If you want to say more about it, so I understand where you're, why you're raising this. But certainly Hollywood is one of the biggest perpetuators of the misinformation. And, we can talk about that.
Yeah, she was just sort of like she was just sort of like a dancer, and I think the I forgot the name of the main character, but I think he saved her one time, and actually, I don't remember the movie enough, but I just wondered if he had like a take on that character, because she's like she sort of fit the theme of what you were talking about, being exotic and stuff, because she came on the island.
Well, thank you for bringing that up, and I'm sorry I don't remember that that particular character, but from the way you describe it, we have not really progressed that far in terms of moving away from these one-dimensional caricatures, and whether it's Lucy Liu today or the girl in Karate Kid. And I'm going to look it up after this Zoom, but I can imagine what you're saying, and it's going to take all of us, really, our voices, to let Hollywood know that we want all of the characters to be full human beings, not just one select subset. But
Yes.
So thank you.
Thank you, Abdul Majid. Does anybody else have any questions? Yeah, I think that like what Abdul Majid was bringing up is that perpetual image and that stereotype that like many minorities do suffer from Hollywood, and I was quite surprised and very excited that like many movies now like are from Asian Americans or coming from Asian, like they're being also critically acclaimed and receiving Oscars. And like this year, fortunately, we had a Chinese American director who won the Oscar. So I think that at least that shows a little bit of sign of change, and I hope that we do follow in this direction. Professor Leslie Lum, she has a question. There is much discussion about the solutions to hate. Johnny Hoon was recently killed in an unprovoked attack, and his family wants it classified as a hate crime. Can you comment on this approach, or what other approach can we use?
So yeah, there's a lot of discussion about hate crimes and whether this is the right approach. I think, it's especially today when we're also talking about demilitarizing or defunding or abolishing the police, then to talk about hate crimes. And last week, a new hate crimes law was passed. And what did that hate crimes law provide for? What it provided for was to count and investigate incidents of anti-Asian hate. And that's all, because, and this is a whole nother topic, but, ever since I was involved in tracking the Vincent Chin case, which was an issue of a hate crime where the killers, the two white killers, got probation. They were freed. They never spent a full day in jail for beating somebody's head in with a baseball bat. And so while it's called a hate crime and the word crime is in there, it really is to say, you know, we have to pay attention to these things. And so I actually think that the law that was passed this past week was really an advance, you know, to say that these invisible things that have been pretty much ignored. Vincent Chin's killers were not the only ones who were, you know, never punished, you know, never prosecuted properly, never any of those things. And yes, that involves the criminal justice system. The other thing I think I want to say about hate crimes law is that, you know, that was a movement that came out of seeing so many attacks, you know, homophobic attacks, attacks on Black people, attacks on immigrants and people like Vincent Chin, or gender-based crimes, or attacks on people with disabilities that were never pursued. So those are, you know, the federal hate crimes law that was passed under the Obama administration was called the Matthew Shepard, James Byrd Hate Crimes Protection Law, right? Matthew Shepard being a young gay man who was, you know, so brutally beaten and tortured, and so was James Byrd, a Black man who was attacked and killed. And so that is the intent of hate crimes law. We see that laws that were intended to protect often have been used in ways to harm people. And that's also true with the way hate crimes laws have been applied. Why? Why? Because we look at Atlanta, and who are the people who get to name whether there is racism or homophobic or gender-based, you know, animosity in attacking somebody? It's the police on the ground. It's the kind of police who said, oh, this mass killing of Asian women and 2 other people has nothing to do with race. They're the ones who apply the law. And that's a problem. I will say that we have to look very much at other alternatives as well, you know, in terms of you know, how we look at attacks or individual violence, right? We know that today we're in a time of just great distress, you know, for our whole communities, and that the people who are most vulnerable in our communities, the ones who worry about food for their kids, or whether they're going to have a place to live at all, and they are forced to go out because they're essential workers, or they have no choice and they have to work and expose themselves and have no health care. We know that in our most vulnerable communities, people are struggling and are suffering. And sometimes, especially when there's rhetoric that says it's these people who are to blame, that leads to people who are frustrated and angry and don't know what else to do, can lead to violence. And so we see a need for, you know, just basically the safety net, you know, which has been dismantled over so many decades, that can take care of our communities, especially in these times of crisis, that we need mental health, you know, support for our communities as well. And I think if we had that, we would see many of these attacks wouldn't take place. And so, so there are alternatives. There's community policing where people go and, you know, to diffuse a situation, not to, you know, just add to the, you know, the prison industrial complex. And so, so I'm sorry, that was a bit of a long answer to your question, but I think that, you know, how we look at hate crimes protection laws is like, let's find ways to protect people who are vulnerable and who have been attacked historically, but also let's find other ways to prevent these kind of crimes to begin with.
Thank you, Helen. Professor Belnishioka has a question for you.
Thank you, Helen, for coming. I just so appreciate, especially your stories around solidarity between the AAPI and other communities of color, and really pointing out how there's so much history that's missing that we weren't taught. So this is a pretty big question. I know we're at limited time, but I'm just wondering, and I wrote it in the chat, but I'm wondering, given the tensions between the AAPI and other BIPOC communities, in particular the Black community, I'm wondering what you think are some effective strategies to rebuild relationships so that we can work together to dismantle white supremacy, institutionalized racism, and that we're not continually pitted against each other. And I think what's so tricky is that our systems, including at Bellevue College, are built. The systems themselves are built so that we end up having to fight for resources, and I don't think that helps. But I just, as somebody, along with many others on campus who are really trying to build more coalitions, this is a hard one. This is a hard issue, and there have been some really hard issues on campus. Not just this year, but previous years as well. So I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts about what have been some of the most effective strategies to rebuild relationships.
Belle, thank you very much for that question. That really is the question for this century, and I start with history because we have to at least learn from history so that we can stop repeating it. And part of our history is that for the last 4 decades at least, we, the people, our democracy has been bombarded with highly well-funded strategies to divide us, to move us away from this idea that we could ever be unified and that our communities could come together. And in particular, Asian Americans have been used in a way to undermine other BIPOC communities, other people of color. And that has been very, very damaging. And so for activists today, the whole notion of can we come together, can we trust these people, is really, one of the first barriers that need to be overcome when we think about strategies. So there are really on multiple levels. One is why I talk about these things, is because I think we have to even begin to have the image of knowing that there have been people who have stood together. It's not just that Asian Americans showed up today, or in the Vincent Chin case, to support Black people, to support racial equality and equity, and vice versa. So in talking about anti-Blackness within the Asian American community. But so these efforts are going on. The people are doing this every day today, especially in these times. But because these continue to be missing in history, one important strategy for the Asian American community is we have to find ways to lift up these stories, to tell them over and over again, to create images over and over again of our communities coming together, of individuals within our community who are speaking up for, other communities as well as Asian Americans, because we have to overcome this barrier that's been created about us that says we're not. And that's hard. I actually think Asian Americans have a higher bar to pass to even say that a hate incident is a hate incident, because people don't believe that Asian Americans, because we are the model minority racist stereotype, that we somehow don't experience racism, and also we don't care about racism. So we have to cross these constructed barriers that manipulate us. Beyond that, it's the kind of things that are the organizing of building coalitions. But what that means is people in the struggle together, where we actually experience, multiracial unity, or people of different genders and cultures coming together and actually fighting for things together. I think right now, especially with, the pandemic and social distancing, the one-on-one kind of experience is much harder. There's no question about it. And the way society, even in a progressive, way of like, let's have Black studies, Asian studies, Latinx studies, they're still seen as and created as separate, And that does in an environment or an institution like Bellevue College or any other institution where you're told this is the budget. You all have to figure out how to make good with the limited resources, and that automatically pits people against each other. And so, I mean, it's been said, almost like a cliche, but the point is not to divide the pie; it's to make the pie bigger. And just in the news today, I was listening about, where the Biden budget is going to go and how contrary that is to the last 40 years of the federal government, Congress trying to shrink government, and that this administration is trying to expand the resources that are available. If that happened, then the strategy of keeping people divided against each other because of saying, well, there's only a few crumbs here, you guys fight over them, that would be a big way of disrupting that. I mean, clearly we need resources that will lift up everyone, and having people fight against each other for the crumbs is one way to keep using the divide and conquer tactic. And as I said, and Belle, I'm sure you know in your work and teach your students that, divide and conquer is a deliberate strategy. It's a long, old strategy, and it is used with a great precision now. Multi-million-dollar think tanks hire people, out of graduate school in order to think of ways to divide people. And so, so when we are in positions of being pitted against each other, if we don't speak up against that, then we are contributing to the manipulation of all of us. Anti-Asian hate is part of white supremacy. We cannot end anti-Asian hate unless we also work to end, the oppression or the things affecting, the Black community, other BIPOC communities, and vice versa. We will not dismantle white supremacy unless, as long as any group is being attacked, including Asian Americans. So that piece, I think, is not so clear today. I think that piece really has to be, brought forward as much as we can, and really for Asian Americans to show that, what, this stuff about the model minority, that contributes to white supremacy. If you believe that and don't try to unlearn that too, then, you're not decolonizing your own mind either, to see a world where we can actually come together, because we have to. We're not going to dismantle white supremacy or end systemic racism or make Black Lives Matter or end anti-Asian hate or any of the groups that are being targeted today. We will not be able to stop that unless we come together. And so, it's a mindset, I guess I have to say, and as step one. And beyond that, the strategy is really, how do we increase the pie? How do we ensure that everybody gets elevated? So you're right. That was a very big question. And that's about as much as I have been able to think about it these days. But I really think it's the generations, your generation, the generations of the students who are on this Zoom, who are going to have to reimagine and figure out how to dismantle the master's house without using the master's tools, and to create something that does not replicate the master's house, except that we've moved around the deck chairs of the Titanic, but replaced it with people who are somewhat darker. That's not going to do it. And that's the revisioning that we have to work on.
Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts on that.
Thank you so much, Helen. Thank you, Bill, for your question. It's already 12:13. I want to thank everybody who came here today. And I would just like to say that this is Asian American. It's not reduced to a month. The issues aren't reduced to a month. And we're going to continue during the whole month of June offering documentaries. And the first speaker that we have for Pride Month, we partner with the LGBTQ Resource Center, and we want to actually to make this transition also, Helen, since you're such a big advocate of LGBTQ issues. And we're going to have Schuler Baylor come talk to us January 4th. Friday at 1 p.m. So it's the same link. So everybody who's here, like, I invite you to attend. Schuler is a transgender athlete, and he will be speaking to us on January 4th. So thank you so much, Helen, for coming here. And Helen's the last speaker that we have for API Heritage Month, but we will continue the fight, and we will continue advocating for API issues here in Bellevue College and in the region. So thank you so much.
Jordana, thank you so much. Thank you, and I thank everybody in the Bellevue College community for all that you're doing to make the world, the place we all want to be part of. So thank you so much for having me here.